Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk about methods for finding and selecting the best trade shows. My name is Bill Kenny, and I'm the CEO of Meet, and certainly we're excited to be with you today. This is a particular problem that we hear from quite often from clients where there are just so many events to choose from, and there tend to be a lot of kind of unique habits that companies have when it comes to selecting shows. So we hope today through this to help you with this process and maybe to share a few I think real neat tools that will help you do a better job at this. And certainly we're happy to help if you need it. So our format here is I'm going to go off screen here in just a moment. We'll put some slides up, and certainly we have got some concepts to share with you. Thank you to those who submitted questions. We'll be addressing those as well. And then I'll come back on screen and address any of the submitted questions plus any that you put in while we're going here. So it's a real pleasure to be with you. I'd certainly ask that you submit any questions, and we look forward to sharing some really neat ideas with you. So let me hop over to my screen here. Just one second. One moment. Let's try this again. Here we go. And I'm going to go here and here. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides now. Again, we're focused on finding and selecting the best trade shows for participation and exhibiting. This is what we end up seeing with a lot of folks where ultimately they do a bit of a survey of the market, but when it comes to selecting, there isn't really a process that is reliable and one that is repeatable and that has a real future value in terms of guiding the organization with their event selection decision. And event selection is really important because it ultimately will drive what you produce. So if you want to get good return on an investment, certainly focusing and selecting the right events will have a big determinant on that. Again, this is really analogous to if you are a fisherman, this is where you choose what body of water you're fishing in. So maybe you've selected you want to fish for tuna. It's not a good idea that you go and fish for tuna in fresh water because they don't exist there. And they exist at a certain places of the ocean. They exist at certain depths. They respond to certain bait. And that's all very specific to tuna. And so the first thing, obviously, we're going to do is kind of figure out what kind of fish we're aiming for, but we better also figure out what body of water they exist in. And usually it's a very small part of a big body of water. So yeah, better off to aim when we're throwing darts, not to guess at where to throw. So just so you see them, here are the questions that were submitted. We will be going through these at the end and any others that are submitted as we go. Here's our agenda today. So we're going to talk about the purpose of exhibiting and the goals of exhibiting, and that will certainly help us determine how to select the best shows. And then we'll talk about some of the challenges that we see organizations having, and then share some solutions and systems for how maybe to do it better. And how all of this then complements whatever measuring you'll do in terms of the results and the return on investment you get from the trade shows, and how that might help you adjust your strategy as you go forward. And again, finally, your questions. So just so you have a little bit about me, so there's context to my comments here. Again, my name is Bill Kenny. I'm the founder and CEO of Meet. And personally, I have about 30 years experience in events, both as an exhibitor, as a trade show host. So I've run several trade shows, and now certainly in working with companies. And the perspective of kind of having all three of the roles related to trade shows really, I think, has helped me develop a pretty round understanding of what the best practices are. And certainly, I've seen tons of organizations that are frustrated and those that are wasting money and really don't know why or how. But it's endemic, and I guess our experience has been about 90% of the companies that we see are underutilizing by a fair amount what they could get out of trade shows. So it's something that's real passionate for us to help folks do better at it and to be much more productive. So our company Meet, again, just so you have context, this isn't a sales pitch, but we help growth companies and pavilion hosts effectively exhibit at trade shows. So that could be anything from, as I said, a growth company that's entering the U.S. It could be a growth company that's already in the U.S. market. We're certainly most effective in the U.S. or companies that are coming to the U.S. And then pavilion hosts would be either economic development organizations or associations who are hosting many growth companies under one roof within a trade show. So either an individual growth company or or in that pavilion type setup. So what we deliver are really four core services. One is to develop the strategy, so selecting show selection and then the strategy by show. And then we provide staffing. We'll get the executive speaking opportunities, and then we'll do a variety of sales support services such as appointment setting and so on. All right, so let's get to our content because that's why you're here. So first, let's talk about the purpose of trade shows and why we would attend, and then what our goals generally are, and kind of the standard disclaimer here for this. We're focused on working with business to business companies, so this is going to come from that perspective. Some of this may tweak a little bit if you're aiming at consumer companies, but this is from the context of a B2B target. So the primary purpose of exhibiting at a trade show and is to identify and connect to volumes of quality prospects. And so again, this is not a consumer situation where we're going to be selling at the trade show. Really what we want is to identify quality prospects. Now, there are a variety of other sort of sub-purposes possibly to exhibiting. And that, you might also be trying to find partners, or you might be doing a variety of other things. There might be speaking that would happen that would be more brand building and so on. But again, we're talking about the primary purpose. If you look at the booth and what we want to have happen at the booth, we want to separate the general attendee from our prospects. And so if there are 10,000 attendees, we want to find the 100 that are prospects. So, and prospect is a really important term, and I want to make sure that we agree on kind of the definition. So when we look at a prospect, because we see sort of a lot of people really broaden the definition of a prospect, we look at three things. And this rule is very simple, and hopefully you take it with you. A prospect has to have a need. So this is a someone or an entity that has a need, and they have to realize it, and they have to have money to resolve that need or to satisfy that need. And finally, they have to have urgency. And so the easiest way to remember this is need money now. And again, a prospect has to have all three of these attributes, not just two of the three or one of the three. They have to have all three in order to qualify as a prospect. And so we want to use our booth to find the prospects within the event. And so there's very specific strategies that we'll talk about with regard to that. And actually our next webinar in April will be just focused on what we do in the booth to separate out the general attendee or our particular prospects from the general attendee. So again, we want to find 100 of 10,000 or a couple hundred of 50,000, and so it has to be very precise. So within an event, our goals, of course, number one would be prospect identification. And then second would be to meet uh, prospects that are already in the sales funnel. So we want to, if they already have a proposal or they're at some stage in our sales funnel and they're going to be at the same events as us, we excuse me, want to take advantage of that time to get together with them, continue the process of lead nurturing, and move them along towards close or towards elimination, either one. But ultimately, the efficiency of meeting them when we're all in the same location is fantastic. And so in the booth, we want to have people who are expert on engagement and enrollment. And then we want to have the salespeople meeting the are the prospects, the entities that are already in our funnel. Again, already have proposals or already somewhere in that lead nurturing channel. So they've already been sort of qualified as a prospect. Third is certainly shows are unbelievable for competitive intelligence. So we want to utilize events for that purpose as well. And actually, just to back up to this, this one that's sort of dawning on me here that I didn't mention up off the top, and I'd say is a definite goal of um, shows, and particularly for early stage companies, is hypothesis testing. So the really cool thing that you can do at shows, and this can help with your prospect identification, is testing both offers and value propositions. So imagine it's a 3-day event. In the morning, you could test a specific offer in the booth. In the afternoon, you could test a different offer. So in other words, an offer is what would get somebody to stop and opt in, just like they would online. And so you can use a show each day or in each half day, each segment, to test various hypotheses around what is going to be a good offer for your specific prospect. And so you can do it just like you would online. You can test offers, you can A/B test, and so on. So it's all really pretty good, and you get just rapid feedback, really kind of critical. So let's go to common challenges, and these are things that we see all the time when we're working with clients who are before we get there, trying to work through how to select and identify great events. So one thing that's always interesting is sort of that fear of missing out, or some refer to as FOMO, but that idea that you've always done a particular event and the fear of not doing it this year or not doing it again, we see as a huge challenge where organizations sort of get caught in patterns of participating and they get into a comfortable place with specific events and ultimately events that aren't necessarily where their best prospects are. And so we want to make sure that we don't have herd mentality, that we go to events simply because everybody else is. On the other hand, we don't want to not go to events, certainly just because everybody else isn't there. So we want to apply a much more analytic overlay on how to make our decisions. So just because we've always done it doesn't mean it is a good idea for us now. Another challenge that organizations have, and we see this quite often, is they don't refresh the view on what events are available in the marketplace. So events are perishable. In other words, they don't, just because an event happened this year doesn't mean it's going to happen next year, or this quarter doesn't mean it's going to happen next quarter. And likewise, there are new events entering the marketplace all the time. And so we want to have a full view of what's going on. And there is some truth to the idea that first time or second time events can have the best value. Not all the time, and I certainly wouldn't make that a common practice to select events simply because it's a first time event. But there is some sizzle to the new kid on the block sometimes. And so it's important to know what events are emerging because often they will invest in marketing. They'll have a unique spin. They'll do something that will attract our potential prospects. And so sometimes the old events are the best, sometimes they're not. And so we want to make sure that we've got a full view and that we can properly evaluate events, because there's a fair amount of expense in hard dollars in going to events and participating, but there's, I would say, even bigger expense in terms of the time it takes to prepare, the time it takes to participate, and also to follow up. And so we want to make sure that when we're spending our time, we're spending our money, that we're getting a good return. And so taking a little bit of time, investing a little bit into making sure you have an updated view as you're making decisions is really important. Certainly a lack of focus is a challenge for a lot of organizations. The idea that, whether it's scarcity mentality or just not going through the steps to properly define their buyer personas, and so they tend to be a bit random or a bit broad in terms of who they're aiming at, which ultimately determines what trade shows they go to normally, and or how they go to those trade shows. And so, the lack of focus can be a real killer in terms of selecting the right event. So that's something we certainly want to address. There's a term, and some of you know it, but if you don't, buyer persona. So the persona is sort of a depiction or a characterization of a type of buyer for your product or service. So, it might be a mom between the ages of 30 and 50, and of course that's a B2C persona. A B2B might be a growth company that is in the healthcare market space, and so it would really be describing those specifically who within that healthcare company is your buyer. So maybe it's a physician, and it's a physician who particularly deals with obstetrics. And so ultimately it's about sort of mapping out that persona. But what we tend to see happen is that organizations will, if they've gone to the extent of mapping out their buyer personas, that who they're targeting will tend to broaden and to creep as they begin going to market. And so it really takes quite a discipline to stay focused and sort of honor those personas, because again, we all have limited resources, time and money, and this is about how do we apply those most advantageously. And that's really the goal here. So we want to avoid persona creep. And then finally here, the fifth challenge is going big versus specific. And so there's some attraction certainly to going to large events where we're going to potentially meet high volumes of potential prospects. The challenge is many big events are more general, and so it will, the ratio of prospects per attendee is much lower than if we're participating in specific events. And and so we want to analyze that ratio and really get a sense of the sort of number of prospects per dollar spent or per time spent, and also the dilution factor, right? So if we're at a say 2-to-1 2 attendees per one prospect, that's 50%. That seems like a pretty nice number. Even a small number, that's a pretty nice number. Whereas often if we go to a more general show, a large, more general event, we might be 100-to-1, or even several hundred, or even 1,000-to-1. And so it might be, there might be 100 or hundreds of thousands of attendees, but still, if we're dealing with a ratio of several 100-to-1 in terms of attendee to prospect, then that dilution will be fairly expensive, and it'll be hard for our prospect to find us. And that's really what has to happen at a trade show is your prospect has to find you. It's sort of like again, imagine fishing in the ocean and being in a big ocean and our fish not really being determined in terms of any specific area. And so we have to have really good baits, a really good offer to get them to stop by and to find us. And um, and in fact, sometimes it doesn't really matter how good your offer is. If they never get to your corner of the trade show, then all is sort of lost there. So again, we're not saying that big is bad. We're just saying that we have to weigh the size and the ratio of prospects to attendees so that we properly assess the value of each opportunity. This isn't a perfect process, but it certainly gets better as we understand where the challenges are, and we can fairly evaluate that quantitatively. So let's talk through some solutions and see what might fit you. And so there are, I think, a variety of solutions. So when we look at trade shows, and this is more of a general comment first, and so we really break down when we're selecting trade shows. We break them down in a couple of ways. We look at the maturity of the organization, and so for companies that are ready for the national market, we're certainly looking at national and global events. For earlier stage companies that really are just getting out into the market now, we're going to look at a strategy that's more local and regional. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the frequency of events is high. So if you get involved in a say it'd be a national or even global organization that has a chapter near you, then your frequency of events is going to be much higher and much more intimate. There'll be a smaller number of people, and so you could potentially get together with people once a week, once a quarter, once a month, something like that, and as opposed to once a year, which most trade shows are once a year. And so the idea of frequency and smaller allows a young company to come in and do a few things. One is to test a variety of hypotheses. At every interaction, every meeting, you can test hypotheses. That frequency will also allow you to train people. You're still learning the language of how to represent your product or service, how to sell it, and that language will improve as you go and as you get feedback, and whether that's verbal or nonverbal feedback. And the other element here is that as you sort of mature to that place where you're going to national and global events, then you have already built a community of advocates by participating at a local and regional level. So when you get to the big event, to the big stage, you're not necessarily new, and you've already got a pre-built community of advocates that can send people to you and cooperate with you to really leverage the most out of the events. And that's the key. And when we look at events, we're really looking at a variety of types of participation. Certainly we think of exhibiting as sort of the number one, but there's also certainly sponsoring. There's walking through. And so we want to assess which events we're going to exhibit at, which ones we're going to sponsor, which we're going to walk through. We also might do some hospitality, so we want to assess that. Some of the events we might target speaking at. And then certainly with more local and regional organizations, we're going to be regularly attending. So versus walking through sort of an annual event, we're going to really roll up our sleeves at a local event where we're fully engaged, we're attending, we're participating, and we're engaged on a very committed basis to not just learn, but build relationships, get feedback, all those types of good things. So just a little preface to getting into solutions. We want to look at solutions for more mature companies being sort of national and possibly global events, not necessarily leaving behind the local and regional events. That's an important part of the strategy, but the earlier stage companies, we're going to not necessarily look at the national and global events as much as we will a local and regional strategy to begin sort of building that competence at telling the story and connecting and so on. So when we look at focus, it's really important to first map our buyer persona. So before we go and look at, sort of what events are available, we want to first know who we're targeting, and this is analogous to deciding what fish you're going to be fishing for. And there's no reason to buy the lures or the bait or the boat, the waders, any of the equipment, or make a decision about where we're going until we figure out who we're targeting. And that really informs everything else. It really tells us exactly what to do from here. So you kind of need to slow down to speed up and take some important time to define who you're selling to very specifically. And I promise you cannot be too narrow here. Getting focused is really important. If you want more information on this, I'd love to dig into it now more with you, but we actually just did a webinar on this last month, and it was titled "Everyone is Not a Prospect: How to Focus and Win at Trade Shows." The YouTube address is here, but certainly ping me. I can email you this address, and I will put it in the comments of this video on YouTube. So once we post this video, I'll put the "Everyone is Not a Prospect" webinar link into the comment section of that posting. But I highly recommend, if you want to go through the process of mapping your buyer personas, that webinar will walk you through it in much more detail and much better than I could in a minute or two here. So that'll give you great info. So after we figured out who we're going to target, then next we want to search. We want to build our knowledge of what's available in the marketplace. So certainly the ubiquitous tool to use for this is Google. You may have another favorite search tool, but that's easy. That, however, just gives you sort of one layer of view, and it will give you a lot of information, and you'll be able to look at a variety of organizations, associations, specific events, and so on, and to really map it out. Beyond that, where you're going to get additional insights that will be really valuable will be to use your network. So looking at people who are in your industry, who are targeting, and ultimately here, it's less important that they're in your industry. Maybe even more important is that they're targeting the same buyer that you are. And so understanding that, and then identifying and talking to them and identifying what events they like the most, and maybe what associations or organizations they like, and then of course what events. So use your network. We see this not nearly done enough, but talk to people who are ahead of you and are, again, selling to that same buyer persona. That's just a great way to identify additional events and organizations that should be considered. And then finally, look at where your competitors and partners are. What events are they going to? And so you'll through this process develop a really good view of what, it's a moment in time. You're just measuring sort of today or the week that you're doing this sort of research, but at that moment you're finding as much as you can about what's available in the market, and then you stop, and then you begin to score the events that are there. So this is just a cutout of a spreadsheet, actually, of one of our assessments. This is actually a real assessment. So each row is a specific event, and this is actual scoring that we did for a client. And so you first want to you sort of put all the events in, and there's some columns to the left where we're putting in some details, and some columns to the right where we're looking at what competitors are at these events and how we will participate, whether we'll walk through or speak or exhibit or sponsor or do a hospitality. So all that sort of is laid out to the right. But here we're saying with with each of these specific events, how do we score them? So the Q score would be the quality of the audience, and so depending on, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the density of prospects per attendee, we'll weigh this differently. So in our case, 5 is a high number for us, so that's the top end of the scale. 1 is low, and and these are all ranked. All these events are ranked by the sponsor score, which is the green column to the right. So understandably, the quality score is high on these. And you'll see that the next column is a weighted average. So we're actually weighting the quality of the audience 3 times greater than any of the other criteria. And so, you can weight criteria as well. You can do a variety of things to give certain criteria more weight or less weight than others. For us, for this particular client, 3, at least as an initial place to start, made a lot of sense. And so, so that 5 is high, and then of course we're multiplying that by 3. Then the next column over, the third column, is the quantity of the audience. So you can tell the first event, very small. 1 is the lowest number we have. So very small, very intimate. And that actually got the highest score from a sponsorship standpoint, and actually almost the highest score from an exhibiting standpoint. What is it? It looks like it's the 4th highest score from an exhibiting standpoint. So it would be selected, depending on what we want to do, it would be selected for either one of those. And then what's the duration? Because we want to assess the number of interactions we could potentially have with any given client. And that also tells us the amount of sort of investment in time as well. So there's a benefit to more time, but there's also a cost to more time. We want to at least somehow have that in our formula. We want to look at what the cost to exhibit is and what the cost to sponsor. And so 4 would be, in this first one, would be a lower cost. 5 would be the lowest cost because we want to value that higher. And then, of course, as you go down to 1, those are the most expensive, either on the exhibiting or sponsorship standpoint. And then looking at the sponsor type, and we've made notes that aren't revealed here, but there are notes. You'll see a little triangle in the second row where where the different descriptions are for each of the columns. But the sponsor type, what we're valuing and what makes it as a 5 in this case are sponsorship opportunities where there is bidirectional interaction with prospects. So in other words, we're going to value in this case sponsorships where maybe we're able to do roundtables with some of the attendees, or maybe we're able to do some kind of a meet and greet, anything like that where there is a 2-direction communication. So that's a 5. A 3 would be where we're just doing one direction communication. So in other words, maybe we're able to introduce speakers or, something like that, where we're, are able to make some comment to the audience that we wouldn't find as valuable as 2-direction communication. And then of course, number 1 here would be no sort of communication, really just a branding opportunity, of which we never recommend generally for any of our clients. We want to talk to people. There's a lot more exchange that can happen. We want to learn at every occasion. And when you're just a logo, we haven't found a lot of value in that. And then the next column, we want to assess the potential cost of travel. So things that are on the same coast or maybe in the driving distance would be a 5, on the same coast a 4, and then diminishing to a 1 where you have to leave the country. So that kind of simple process. And then certainly we have it set up to weight travel as well, although we weighted it as a one, so it doesn't have any more impact than the rest of the items other than the quality of the audience. And then finally, the yellow column is the average total assessing the exhibiting criteria, and the green column is the average total representing just the sponsor related criteria. So there's it's overlap in those. Some of the criteria apply to both. Some of the criteria are unique to either exhibiting or sponsoring. And again, you might be also weighting or have criteria related to which events you should walk through, which events you should speak at or do hospitalities at, and so on. We found that once we've assessed an event for specifically exhibiting, we can make a lot of the other decisions. So sponsoring usually is fairly low on our recommendation list for a lot of events, but events that, are still, score fairly high, but don't make sense to exhibit at, we're, likely going to send people to walk through. We're going to target specific events where there's real good opportunity to speak as well. We may do some hospitalities, again, depending on the situation, executive briefings, things like that. And executive briefings don't necessarily need to happen in conjunction with an event. They can happen independently and or with partner organizations and so on. But this gives you a sense of scoring, and certainly it gets very situational and very unique to each client and each target persona. But this gives you sort of a good representative example of how you might score. And then we get to deciding. So now that we've got scores, we decide. So we overlay the data that we've sort of developed here, that all those various rankings that we've created, also our assumptions, because this is version 1, and then our experience. And so we may have people on the team who have experience at specific events or with specific organizations who can add anecdotal information that also should come into the formula. And we certainly want to, experience is really important and can help us beyond the numbers in some wonderful ways. And from this, we're going to create an initial plan. And I say initial, the idea here is that we look at this information once a quarter and refresh it, update it, so that we can evolve the plan. The plan is dynamic. So we want to make sure that we're learning and evolving so that, after a few quarters, we're very well refined and we've kind of honed our message, where we're targeting, and the results that we're getting. We want to continue to evolve that. So when we refresh, we want to review the results. What have we been able to generate from the events that we've participated in the last quarter? We'll take another look at what's available in the marketplace and to add new opportunities that weren't available the last time we looked. We'll continue to adjust the plan and tweak it so that we're optimizing the events and organizations that we're participating in on a regular basis. So measuring results, and this is always kind of a question that gets asked, and when you've gone through this process of sort of scoring your events and having a strong basis with which you make decisions, the idea of measuring results and adjusting is much easier. And in fact, you'll see that there are actually some byproducts of this that create even more opportunities and better opportunities. So if we use our scoring as our basis, the kind of what we just created when we looked at what's available in the marketplace and how we would rank the opportunities, this can now be our basis for evaluation. Excuse me. And as we do this, there are going to be some neat opportunities that come with this. So Besides our basis, there are a variety of things we can measure, and you may have some items or things that go beyond what I'm suggesting here, but this is sort of a base level of things you might look at measuring. So opt-ins, this would be the number of people that stopped by the booth and said they wanted our offer. In other words, they said, I have the problem that you've represented in your offer. You can also measure the number of first meetings that get scheduled from your opt-ins. You can measure the number of proposals that happen from the first meetings that happen from the opt-ins. You can measure the number of sales or the revenue that happens from those proposals, from those first meetings, from those opt-ins. And so you can get to a very hard number in terms of, sort of the revenue per lead, the leads per sale, the revenue, or I'm sorry, the leads per show, the revenue per show, and so on. And ultimately, the opt-ins, if we go through this process of understanding a buyer persona and then have an offer that corresponds to that persona, our opt-ins are going to be reasonably well qualified prospects. Not perfect. Obviously, it's got to be a conversation. We need to understand them better. But if somebody has the problem that you're representing in the offer that you have in your booth, they've gone a long way down the path of pre-qualification. And so again, you may add additional items or tweak these, what to measure by event, but as you start to map out the number of events you go to and what your results are, you'll easily be able to begin comparing the value of each event, because you now know the cost of the event, you know the amount of time you had to put into it, and then sort of being able to measure the results versus that investment. You'll have a much better sense of what each is worth. Now, when you do this, the cool thing is, let's just imagine that you participate in, let's say it's 5 events a year, and that may be sort of a quarterly trade show, and then some other more progressive event that maybe it's a monthly meeting of some kind. So, 4 are annual trade shows, and 1 is an organization that you're doing monthly meetings. So each of these is going to produce at different rates. So imagine that you take your 4 trade shows that you're participating in. There are going to be 2 that are in the top half in terms of performance, what you generate per dollar, and there are going to be 2 that are on the bottom half. Imagine being able to go to the organizers of the 2 on the bottom half and to share the results that you've had over the course of 12 months, and to be able to say, hey, we want to do your event again next year, again, assuming you do, and to be able to negotiate with them to where you don't really care if they reduce your cost or they increase your exposure. Ultimately, it all goes to value. What you want is that you have more value for the dollar spent, which means you need to produce and connect to more qualified leads. And so what you want to do is represent this stuff, any of this in terms of, how the shows are comparing against each other, but it very quickly allows you to sort of utilize that information to help. And what you'll find is actually most trade show hosts really want you to succeed, and nobody ever comes with this information, but when you do, you're able to give that comparison that helps them help you, and ultimately they're going to be normally pretty excited to do that, because they want to renew you as a client. They want to have you as a testimonial, and the only way to do that is with really good information. So we want to course correct. Most of our clients find that it's best to do this on a quarterly basis. So again, kind of reviewing what's happened, refreshing what's available, and then adjusting so that you're using your current view to help you optimize what you're taking advantage of in the marketplace. And so, you're always, I mean, we usually find it's best to always be looking at least 12 months ahead. With some industries, we might even look 18 and 24 months ahead, particularly for speaking opportunities. That tends to be important in some industries, particularly in healthcare. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but ultimately the goal is to be much more precise in our aim and our actions so that we get a bullseye with all of our trade show related efforts. And again, you're going to have a variety of ways that you participate in trade shows, but we want to really optimize the ones that we're selecting so that we have the best chance of connecting with high quality prospects and really volumes of high quality prospects. So we'll hop to your questions here in just a moment, but I want to make sure I mentioned our next April or our April webinar. The title is Booth Bait: Why You Should Stop Giving Away iPads Now. Essentially, what are we going to do in our booth to attract prospects? And in fact, we only want to attract prospects. And so what are we going to do that's going to cause that to happen? And I think you're going to find this really informative. And again, just like you would if you were fishing, we want to make sure that once we've determined the fish and we've determined where we're going to fish, we want to have the right bait that will attract the fish we're aiming at. So we want tuna, we don't want salmon. We want tuna, we don't want codfish, right? So we want to make sure we get only the fish that we're aiming at. And this particular webinar is going to be on Friday, April 27th at noon Eastern time, Eastern US, that is. And certainly look forward to having you there. We'll send out info on how to register for that, but certainly want to make sure you know about it. Just so you have my contact info, it's here. Again, Bill Kenny. Feel free to call. That's my cell. Don't hesitate. I love getting calls and questions, and certainly would be tickled to talk to you. And also my email, bill@meet, MEETROI.com. So again, happy to talk to any of you and help with any of your items. And we're certainly excited that you're with us today. So let's hop out to your questions. So I'm going to come back on screen here, and let me just hop over to our window and see if there are any additional questions that have been added. No additional questions added, but feel free to add any questions. I'm going to now go back over to the questions that were submitted. So the first question is, how do I calculate the ROI? And so ROI from trade shows is sort of the holy grail. We get asked this question all the time. I think there's sort of a standard answer to this, and then I think ultimately it's what do you value most? And so the challenge of trade shows from a standpoint of measurement is that your benefit tends to come over a long period of time, particularly in B2B. But so let's be really succinct. So there's sort of the tangible, which we can measure fairly easily. And I identified maybe 5 things that you could measure. So, the number of opt-ins, the number of appointments that happen, the number of proposals, the number of sales, revenue, number of sales, and then also the amount of revenue would be 5 items that certainly seem important. And also, once you have those, you can begin getting a ratio of, if we can double the number of opt-ins, that doubles the number of our ultimately our revenue from these events. So you begin getting good ratio for how much you can produce if you change certain inputs, and if you get more opt-ins or you get more efficient at getting meetings, you have a better lead nurturing process and so on. Your conversion gets higher, but ultimately you can begin tweaking those levers much easier when you measure that better. Then there's a sort of whole sort of intangible side, the idea that you can message test very quickly and get feedback very quickly. You can use sort of the local and regional events if you're an early stage company to continue to message test. If you're launching a new product, you can, again, do a lot of interesting tests and get such great feedback, really much more immediate than any other media. And ultimately you're face to face with people, so you're getting information that goes beyond the literal. You're getting a lot of nonverbal help as well, so all that is good. But happy to work through any specific questions on ROI with anyone, but that would be sort of the answer there. So how about the next question, being able to show results against trade show costs? And that really goes to the previous question. And again, I think the first thing you have to do is establish what your goals are, and then the metrics to support that or to measure that really should correspond to exactly what your goals are. Next question is how to tell if an event is a good fit if the organizers won't share the organizations attending. Yeah, that's an odd thing. We do see it every once in a while, or we see organizations that force you to opt into their mailing lists and so on in order to get any trade show information. So yeah, it's almost split. There's a decent portion of trade show hosts that sort of share everything, or are giving you good demographic information. Although I would say that there's no consistency in demographic information you get from trade shows when you get it. They all sort of have their own form and own way that they report it, which is a challenge for assessing the value of particular events versus each other. But dealing with organizations that don't share that information, I don't have a perfect answer here. What we do is we tell them the assessment we're going through, and that information is important. And if they don't share with us any audience information, then they're not going to perform very well in our formula, and it's very unlikely that we would choose their event. And so that we need to have it in order to choose their event, and the absence of it would more than likely prevent us from choosing their event. They tend to loosen up a little bit then. It's not perfect, but I think that's really the key, is to impose on them that you're the customer, and having that information. They can sanitize it, they can take the names out. You just need the company names and maybe titles, but they can take the actual individuals or names out and any contact info. Really all you need is who's attending by role, title, company, and so on in order to make a value judgment. The names would be nice, but it's certainly not critical. So the next question is, we need to take road trips to these trade shows. We need to take road trips to these trade shows would affect that would affect your choices. So I think what this is trying to say, and I may be misunderstanding, but I think what this is asking is, do we really, do we need to take road trips to the trade shows to help improve your assessment of a given trade show? And I think that's a really good question. So yeah, what we tend to find is, there are the trade shows, there are the trade shows you don't know, or that just appear on the marketplace. And so it wouldn't be unusual for us to, the first year of participation in a trade show, to not exhibit, not to spend a great deal of money, but actually to walk the floor, maybe to try to get a speaking opportunity, something like that, and use it as an assessment for how that event might fit into our portfolio next year, and into our mix of events. So it does vary, but certainly walking through events is really important. It gives you a lot of opportunity to do competitive intelligence, to not just to assess the show, but to see what what your competitors are doing, and also to look at how the host does in terms of laying out the show, and if it's a good value or not. Um, Often we find that hosts will give you a gratis ticket to have you to come in and walk through if you're doing it as an assessment. So it's certainly worth asking. It's amazing how many will let you in for free. So why not do that if you can? Let's see. And then how to differentiate between necessary and sufficient? It's an interesting question. So when we look at shows, I think this is, I may not be answering this perfectly, but I think I'm kind of reading between the lines to the question here, in that, the what the you're trying to do when you participate in events, I say shows, but more broadly events, is you're trying to generate a consistent flow of quality leads. And so in part, as you map these out, you want to have make sure that any given time of the year, and maybe you look at it quarterly or even monthly, but you want to make sure that there's no time of the year that's um, uh, inordinately heavy with lead generation, and no time of the year that's inherently light with lead generation. So having a good balance as much as possible. And that's why the local and regional events can really act well to create a sustainable flow that can be augmented by sort of the national and global events. But where you have higher frequency, you're going to have a more predictable volume of sort of quality leads that come from those. And you're kind of assured that no month is going to go soft or sort of too heavy either. But when you look at sort of creating quality prospects, they are very perishable. So we want to make sure that we don't, just like a market wouldn't want to buy too many bananas because they only last on the shelf for a week, let's say, and a banana that's sitting around for 8 days or 9 days or whatnot perishes, and so you end up having to throw it away. And maybe there's some secondary use for a few days, but for the most part, it gets thrown away. And the same thing happens with trade shows. Any prospects that you haven't addressed fairly quickly afterwards will certainly perish. And not to say they couldn't be rejuvenated, but it's going to take more effort. There's potential energy that sort of diminishes by the day when we don't follow up, and certainly having too many leads can cause that to happen. Let's see, this particular question, I don't know if it's much of a question or if it is a question. So they provide speed dating approach to meeting clients and contacts. So I guess the idea is that this particular person values that speed dating interaction. Sometimes there are reverse expos where buyers are exhibiting and sellers are walking through. There are all sorts of different formats for these, where you might have company CEOs or key buyers, sort of having meetings with vendors around key needs that the organization has. And those are great formats. Those tend to be pretty expensive. They're on the higher end of the expense scale. So again, it's really about assessing all of this in context. So we don't look at any item. In fact, the big danger of event assessment is what we sort of look at as the lazy Susan approach, where if you don't have a plan, you tend to assess events one by one. In other words, you become aware of it and you're assessing that abstractly. That never works. You have to assess sort of all the opportunities against all the costs. So what's the possibility? What's the potential against what our potential or our specific costs might be? But yeah, the speed dating events, I think, are great. They're interesting. There's certainly more of them coming now, but I would look at them in relation to any of the other options or opportunities you have. How to find Spanish or Latin-based shows centered around economic development? Certainly, using the methods that I mentioned earlier. Certainly using whatever search engine you like most to find them, using your network, and then also looking where other organizations that are targeting a similar customer would be. So I would use all three of those tools. You may find a fourth that also is there, but my sense is finding those, just going to take a concerted effort, but you'll be able to find plenty of Spanish and Latin-based shows focused on economic development. Let's see, the best keywords for search engine or existence of consolidated site portals for search. So I would imagine the person that said this doesn't mean necessarily best keywords, but probably more best search terms to find the events that they're looking for. Um, yeah, and I think if you identify the buyer persona, if you identify the role or title and industries that you're targeting, then your search should be those terms, and you will begin uncovering what opportunities are there to get in front of those buyers. But ultimately, it all starts with identifying who you want to meet, who you want to sell to, and then it goes from there. In this last question, I'm not really sure I understand, but it says interested in aggregated data. So that's not really a question, but maybe if this is your specific question, if you want to either email me or give me a call and let me know what you were hoping to understand from that, I'm more than happy to respond and chat through it with you. I think that looks like all of our questions for today. If you do have other questions, I'll hang for just a moment. Feel free to type them in and we'll address them. I'm not seeing anyone typing, so I'm going to assume we're okay for now. This has been a real pleasure. Again, identifying and selecting events is not easy. It's a process. The cool thing is if you do it in a logical way, you'll be able to evolve the events you select and how you participate in them much better over time. And that's really what you're looking for is, start with a good plan and continue to evolve it, continue to make it more effective for you. And of course, your organization is going to evolve at the same time and your needs are going to evolve. So it really is not only dynamic on the event side, but your organization is going to be dynamic as well. And so selecting the right events it's just going to be a dynamic process, and it's really selection and then how you leverage them, how you execute them. All of that is an opportunity to learn and evolve. This has been fantastic. Again, we so appreciate your time. We'll follow up with an email with the link to this if anyone had to cut out earlier, you came in late, and feel free to share it. Let us know how we did, what other topics would be valuable for you. We do have on our website our schedule for the rest of the year, so feel free to take a look at that, and let us know what questions you have or how we can help you. We're more than glad to do that. So that said, great to talk to you today, and hope to talk again sometime soon. Thanks. Bye now.